Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this session this afternoon. It's brilliant to see so many of you here. My name is Lucy Manning. I'm a special correspondent for BBC News. I've spent the last couple of years doing quite a lot of reporting on terrorism, on extremism. I covered the murder of Lee Rigby and Woolwich, the trial of Michael Adebowale and Michael Adebolajo. 10 days ago, I was part of the team that revealed the name of Mohammed Emwazi as Jihadi John and have spent the last 10 days reporting on that. The issue of women in extremism is a really current one. It's not a new one, but it's a current one. Just last week, one of the senior officers from Scotland Yard said that there are 60 British women, they believe, who have gone to fight with the so-called, gone and joined the so-called Islamic State in Syria. And this year, 20 of those girls who are gone are under the age of 20, and the last 5 women to have gone are just 15 and 16 years of age. I'm delighted to have a really outstanding panel here today. We have Sasha Havlicek, who is the CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and she's done a lot of media work recently on the issue of women going to Syria. We have Åsne Seierstad, who many of you may have read her book, The Bookseller of Kabul, a very award-winning book, and she has just written a book about Anders Breivik and the massacre in Norway. It's called One of Us, and we're really delighted to have you here today. And then at the far end, Shabana Kausar, who is the Women's Aid National Schools Engagement Officer, and does work with schools on domestic abuse and used to do some work on extremism. So I think what we'll do is we have a bit of time. I'll ask, we were supposed to have Hanif Qadir here as well, and unfortunately he has a family illness, so he's unable to be with us. But what I'll do is I will ask each of them to give a small introduction, then I'll do some questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So maybe if I can just ask Sasha to start.
Sure. Just to say a huge thank you. It's overwhelming and inspiring to be here at this sort of setting with so many incredible women around. I don't get a chance working in the security sector to work nearly enough with women. And given the nature of the challenges that we're facing in terms of radicalization and recruitment, and I work on that issue across ideologies, from far right to Islamist, and I work on that issue across the gender divide, of course, but we often see very old school security style responses to a challenge that is new in the sense that it is essentially about a movement. And in beating a movement, we need to be thinking much more innovatively about the sorts of responses that we deploy, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that later. My background is in conflict resolution. My family was from the Balkans. I saw Yugoslavia implode into a genocidal catastrophe, and watching that up close gave me an insight into some of how extremist ideology can grab a hold of even the most absolutely normal people in an integrated, peaceful environment, and how quickly that can happen. In the context of the Yugoslav conflict, that denouement really took place over the course of 1 or 2 years of very systematic media, top-down media frenzy that drove people, whipped people up into a kind of fear that enabled them to do things that are unimaginable, unspeakable. And I came back to the UK in 2006 to set up the Institute because I was struck by the nature of the discourse that had started, I thought, to take hold across Europe, across Western societies, the extent to which communal issues had started to become really rife, and the extent to which we'd started to see what I thought was a set of cumulative extremisms with Islamist, if you like, and far-right populist extremisms goading each other. They are in many ways each other's best recruiting grounds and best recruiting operators. And we see that in very practical ways. And I hope we can talk. I've been asked to come and talk a little bit specifically about this rising trend of women supporting and migrating to Syria to join ISIS. It's an issue that we've done a lot of research on, and that we are trying to look at innovative ways in which to respond in a kind of whole of society response and approach. So I look forward to sharing a bit of that.
Thank Thanks very much. Åsne, if I can turn to you.
I'm a journalist and a writer, and I started off as a Russian scholar, and then as a Russian correspondent. And actually, that's my stay in Russia that led me into being a war reporter, and it started in Chechnya, which is one of the conflicts where women have been fighting and also have been used. And have chosen themselves to become suicide bombers or to fight actively. So being a war reporter in this context has learned me a lot about the social effects of radicalizations, like the political effects. And one thing that is for certain is like, for instance, the example of Chechnya, starting as a movement. They wanted nothing but what Estonia had and Lithuania had and Latvia had. They wanted freedom from the Russian Empire. So it started very much off as a nationalist movement. Now, 20 years later, I would say and argue that the whole country is totally destroyed, morally corrupted, socially corrupted, and 10% of the population is killed. So it's also important to remember those who are being radicalized, because, as is the case for the Chechen black women, mainly because they've seen their families shattered, lost their husbands, lost their children. What is then left to do? So that is part of my background. Otherwise, I worked in Afghanistan, I worked in Iraq, I worked in the Balkans too. And my latest book is about my own country, Norway, and Anders Breivik and his massacres in Norway. And I've studied his extremism, which I realized is maybe, like, of course, what he wants is to rid Europe of Muslims. That's his agenda. But it seems, when you study him and when you listen to him and when you read him, that his misogynist views and his hatred for social democracy, of women, of feminism, sticks deeper, much deeper than the big Islamophobe ideology that he clings to. And I think in these aspects, the two extremist camps, I mean, there are several, of course, but those, the two, to the far right, to one side, the Islamophobe, the counter-jihadi sides, and on the other hand, the Islamic jihadists, or whatever we call them, they have so much in common. And especially when it comes to view on women, on the misogynist, the ideology that they adhere to. And for Breivik, it was, he wanted a society, a patriarchal society, where men rule, where women are going back to the kitchen, where they're becoming like breeding machines, until, as he wrote, we can construct artificial uteruses. I just want to end up with him and his hatred for women. One, like we followed, some journalists, we followed the case for 10 weeks. And there was once when his eyes really sparkled, and that was when he was telling his plans on how to execute the former Norwegian Prime Minister, the first female Prime Minister we had, Gro Harlem Brundtland. She was speaking on the island on the 22nd of July to the youngsters about feminism and about the fight for women's rights. And after that, Breivik had planned to take her, to handcuff her, to make her kneel, and to read a text that he'd written about how she had betrayed Norway. And then after she'd read the text to the camera that he would film and download, he would decapitate her, film it, and put it on YouTube. And this was the time where really this was what it was about for him. So I got the impression, and many with me, that it's really this, there's something about, for some men, if they to see powerful women, to revenge, even like she's retired now, but she was the prime minister all through his childhood. So that's something that is often forgotten in his case.
Thank you so much. Shabana, turning to you and your experiences.
Cool. So again, thank you for inviting me here. I'm equally excited. I wasn't expecting it to be so big and fancy, so I'm a little bit overwhelmed. So I'm from a little small place called Bristol. Represent. So I'm the National Schools Engagement Officer with Women's Aid, but I actually started my career working for the Preventing Violent Extremism agenda for a couple of years. And I was really passionate when I started. I was like, yes, let's end extremism. And actually, it's really important to have diverse people lead that movement, which is why I really wanted to be part of it. But I became quite disillusioned a little bit with some of the approaches and the policies. And I kind of felt there was a lot of elephants in the room that weren't quite being addressed, and some of it was recognizing that extremism isn't some sort of niche special thing that some people do over there. Often it's caused because of universal issues around poverty, discrimination, alienation, and none of that was actually being addressed. So I kind of didn't feel part of that. And then I found feminism, woohoo, and I really felt part of that, and that's the kind of way I ended up sort of shaping my career. And I now work, as I mentioned, for Women's Aid as a National Schools Engagement Officer. But one of the things that I now find is that even within the feminist movement, there's some real issues around division, around othering, and I kind of felt that as a Muslim feminist, there were times when I didn't really feel part of the sisterhood. And I wanted to come today to kind of highlight that, because I think there is a relationship between what's happening nationally and globally around ending extremism, and how that seeped into the feminist movement, and how sometimes brown and black sisters can feel alienated from the sisterhood, and what we need to do to try and include them in order to better protect young women and girls from going abroad, as well as, ending patriarchy. So I'm really interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, but more importantly, what your views are and your experiences, and feed in as and when I can.
Thank you. Thanks. Sasha, if I can start with you, from your analysis and the work that you're doing at the moment, where would you say we are on the issue of women and extremism, and how bad that issue is at the moment, how much of a concern it actually is?
I mean, we've all heard already that this is not a problem that is either confined to specific ideologies. It's also not new. I mean, women's participation and involvement in extremist organizations and terrorist organizations is as old as time. I think that there are certain aspects of the challenge that we're currently seeing in terms of the exodus of young people from across Europe and the West as a whole to Syria that are fairly unique, and we shouldn't underplay how big a challenge this is. Just in terms of numbers, we're talking about unprecedented numbers of young people as a whole going. We are now talking about something in the region of 3,000 Europeans having already gone to Syria, some of them having come back already. Of that number, some 550 are likely to be women. And that's absolutely official estimate. So the number is likely to be higher than that. That is really an extraordinary number of people. I think the nature of this is interesting, because it challenges a whole host of assumptions that as a society I think we readily make. I think we tend to believe that women are essentially victims of extremism, especially Muslim women, that Muslim women must be victims of a certain type of fundamentalist ideology. And here what we see is the complete upending of those ideas. This is a group of women that, lo and behold, are ideologically committed. So young women are just as capable of ideological radicalization as young men.
But some people would say, when you look at the young schoolgirls who have just gone from Bethnal Green Academy, 15, 16 years of age, that they are victims, that yes, they've gone to fight for this very extreme, not fight, but to join up with this extremist group. But they have, in some ways, been brainwashed, and they are victims, and their families are victims.
So I would just say, absolutely, as much as young boys at that age. And I think that the idea somehow that we have as a society that the girls are more likely to have been victimized than the boys, also minors, also being very, very aggressively recruited, is a mistake. So young women we're seeing equally capable of radicalization, of ideological commitment. We shouldn't underestimate that. And I think the real problem here, and you've talked about the push factors, about the sorts of problems that young people might face that justifies in their minds joining these kinds of organizations and groups. I'd love to talk a little bit about the pull factor, because I think that that's been absolutely unique in this case.
I mean, what is attractive?
What is it that essentially gets, and most of the time what we're seeing is that these are educated middle-class kids, and in particular with the girls, very successful academically, the three girls that just went, Aksa Mahmood before, I mean, really talented young women that you could imagine doing many, many other things, being drawn into this. And I think we've vastly underestimated the strength of this incredibly sophisticated, tech-savvy propaganda recruitment machinery that's been deployed. In the recent period, it's been hypercharged through social media and the internet. And we're talking about a really, really sophisticated peer-to-peer marketing strategy that would be the envy of many social media marketing companies. They know how to sell something very specifically to very specific constituencies. And women have been a target. The female factor is valued by extremist organizations, even though women have been completely underestimated by the security services in this space. And they're valued for a number of reasons. I think they're not valued because, as we can see from the press response, they have massively high PR value for these organizations, because they're saying, look, we chose to leave our lives in the West and to join this movement. That says something. They're valuable because they are part of a troop morale strategy. There's a marriage bureau that was set up in Raqqa. So these girls are arriving out there, being match made with young jihadis out there. They're valuable because this project is not just about fighting. Brand Caliphate is drawing women in unprecedented numbers because it's about building the new state. It's about a heroic, historic project about building a new world. And so they're being deployed to come and rear the next generation of jihadis, and part of their ideological commitment is in fact to be part of that project of rearing that generation of jihadis. And I think that the propaganda machinery is something that we haven't been looking at enough, but it's not new. It's based on 25 years of a very successful propaganda and recruitment machinery that has been successfully really targeting very young people and increasingly younger and younger people. So there is a kind of grooming dimension to this, although it's not sexual in nature.
Åsne, you talked about the work in Chechnya. Do you think this problem of extremism is getting worse, or we're just hearing more about it because of social media and things like that?
Well, I think what we see now is unprecedented in the way that it's happening in all European countries, including America, Canada, other Western, and of course Middle Eastern countries. Most of the jihadists are going from Tunisia, going from Saudi Arabia, going from the Middle East. So it's definitely part of what Sasha was saying. There is, young people are drawn to this, whether it's for the propaganda machinery, whether it's for the ideology, for the religion. I have not studied that, there are other people who have studied that, but there's obviously a trend of extremism that is in a society today, and in that case, whether it's Breivik or whether it's the three young girls, they're part of this trend of finding solutions on the fringes of the political spectre or far outside the political spectre, but believing that the world is black and white, it's us and them. And if we rule, we have to get rid of them. So that's also the very similarity in their approach. Like you have the far right, where Breivik is one of their spokesmen, like the extreme far right. His dream is to rid Europe of Muslims, so they will either have to convert, be deported, or killed. And all their, of course, all mosques and synagogues, everything will be eradicated, and you have the same in the dream city of Raqqa or the center of their caliphate, where we see now how they destroy the Syrian cities, where they kill the Christians. So it's definitely something in our days today that among young people there's an appeal for extremism, when and in difference from then the Chechen case or the Palestinian case, where also women have been fighting and being suicide bombers, where they've been more these conflicts have been more local, and they've been more. It seems that the women there and men have been radicalized more by the atrocities they've seen, by loss of family, or by concrete feeling of this is the only way that we can be heard.
I mean, we've obviously over the last few months heard about the attacks in Paris and Copenhagen, but obviously it's worth pointing out that one of the worst attacks on European soil was Anders Breivik's far-right attack. 77 people in Norway killed in that. And when I was obviously researching this and reading about the book that you've written, I was really struck by reading that his manifesto was very, very misogynistic, very anti-women. And as a journalist I wasn't involved with the coverage of the Breivik attack, but obviously I followed it on TV and the newspapers. I was struck by the fact that I didn't really know that. And I wonder how many people in the audience knew that his manifesto was very, very misogynistic and wasn't just railing against Islam and multiculturalism and immigrants, but very much women as well. I wondered if you thought that had been downplayed at the time, or whether that just didn't get through to audiences outside Norway.
No, it was downplayed, definitely, and because it was less visible. He didn't really. It's there in the manifesto, but it's not what he talks about. What he talks about is the hatred of Muslims, and it seems that that's something that he can adhere to in a way. There's the overbuilding of it, and that's where he gets resonance on the internet, and where he stayed in those echo chambers of the internet, where whatever you put in, it will just be amplified, getting back to you. His case of misogyny is kind of unique to him too, because many of the anti-jihadist groups and movements are now talking about they're against Muslims, but they talk about women's rights, because they see that that could be something that and gay rights too. So it's a new right wing. It's not any longer the original, like the traditional fascist movement, but it's because it's mainly like a one case movement which is anti-Islam. But in his case, it's I think we have to look at the psychological reasons too, and see whether personal meets the political. And I think that's also sometimes we forget with a very young jihadist that there is a psychological background. And I was struck when I read the biographies of the French killers, the French terrorists in Paris, in Charlie Hebdo, and to see how their childhoods mirrored Breivik's childhood, just like they both. Like the two brothers and Breivik, they grew up with single mothers, and the absence of a father is a factor when it comes to joining terrorist movements. A father's gone in both cases. Both women had grave psychological problems. Both social services in the countries, in France and in Norway, wanted to take the children away from their mothers. In Breivik's case, the whole family was in for observation, and the clear recommendation from the psychiatrist was that if this boy is not taken away from his mother, we are afraid of serious maldevelopment issues with him. That did not happen, and in the two brothers' case, the social services wanted to take the 5 kids away from the mother because she visibly couldn't take care of them. They were out all night. She became a prostitute, and there's also that was also partly stories about Breivik's mother, that she did too. The French authorities took 3 of the children from her, and they left her with 2, which is those 2 Kouachi brothers. And these 2 kids, they found their mother having committed suicide in the flat when they were 10 and 12. And then we talk about they were radicalized by the Iraq War, by the caricatures, by the mutilation of Abu Ghraib. But we don't really discuss what made them fertile ground for these ideas. And the same for Breivik.
Yet what we're seeing at the moment with some of the women and girls going to Syria is families who are, I mean, you talk about respectable isn't the right word, but, you know, Aqsa Mahmoud, who is one of the poster girls for the Islamic State, she was from Glasgow, a university student, parents who came out to say how disappointed and disgusted they were by her. These girls who have gone out from Bethnal Green, grade A students. Shabana, I wonder, is this phenomenon of these schoolgirls going out, is this just another form of rebellion? How in our day, you know, we would run off to, you know, I'm from Leeds, you'd run off to Manchester and go and see some boys. Instead, they're running off, and whereas people might protest on the streets about the Iraq War, this is the new rebellion. I mean, you're at the coalface. What sort of ideas do you get from why people are falling into extremism?
Sure. I mean, I don't have the simple answer to that. I think it's not necessarily teenage rebellion, because perhaps it'd be a lot more widespread than it actually is. It's not like they're smoking weed or anything, you know, they're going over and they are very much being part of this movement that's killing people. But I definitely think there's something in there around, so Sasha, you spoke about the pull, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, but I think it's more than that. I think it's a pull and a push. And I think there's something in that kind of relationship that's putting this pressure on these young girls. So definitely there's this lure, and I'm really pleased you used the word grooming, because I think actually we need to be using this word when we talk about young girls going to join ISIS, because a lot of them are being fed this information that's, you know, you'll be promised this, or you'll get a you know, a husband at the end. I mean, you know, so many of us are told the husband's the best thing that we should all strive for. You know, these are things that, you know, young girls are told are very much define who they are. So there's definitely that pull, but I think there is that push then, that maybe that for some it's that teenage rebellion, but actually for others I think it's a little bit more deeper than that. I think it's a reaction to feeling isolated, perhaps, not being understood. I mean, maybe that is teenage rebellion, I don't know. But it's interesting, because my younger sister, she's 22 and she's agnostic. She's unsure, but she's definitely not Muslim. And literally a couple of weeks ago, she said, "Shabana, you know, the next time you pray, can I join you?" And I was like, "What? You know, sure, yeah, but you know, why? Like, you know, we always have debates about religion, and you're always kind of like, I'm not sure it's for me." And she kind of we started speaking, and she said, "It's really interesting what's happening around the world, and I wanna engage with this." And I thought that's so interesting. You're not interested in religion because of its spirituality, you see it as a political movement. And I think there's something in that. And she also sort of name-dropped Malcolm X, you know. And I think there's something in that. I think religion has been considered, for many, particularly Islam, a political tool. It's not even a spiritual tool as much for some young people. And I think that's often a reaction to a lack of voice, lack of power in other ways. So, and we see this in America. I mean, Islam is the fastest growing religion. A lot of people converting in America tend to be black men who are in jail and in prison. So for them, Islam is a way of empowering themselves. In the most case, it does just that, and it's fantastic. But in a very small minority, what it's doing is it's speaking to vulnerable young minds and saying, you have no political power, here, we'll give you some, as well as a washing machine and a husband, you know, empower yourself. And I think there's something in that that's really dangerous. And I think we need to see these young girls as victims, and I don't think we are. I'm quite vocal on a lot of Facebook pages around feminist issues, and I remember somebody posted something about, you know, these young girls. There was an article going around saying these young girls have been groomed. What's people's thoughts? And it was just so interesting, you know, the number of sort of white liberal feminists who were like, it's disgusting, it's vile, they know exactly what they're doing, how dare they know they're killing people, how do they not watch the news? And I was like, yeah, I'm sure to a certain extent they are, but where's this anger coming from? Like, do we have the same anger when young girls join gangs and orchestrate the rape of other young girls? You know, we also recognise that they're being part of this and they are joining something that they're aware of, but we recognise they're also victims in the situation. And I kind of, you know, commented, you know, on Facebook, you know, it goes on. So I thought I'll comment, and I just said something like, look, it's really dangerous using this language, and in a way, arguably, you're victim blaming. You're kind of saying it's all their fault, you know, and this is the same language used for young girls who've been groomed, saying, well, it was their fault they got sexually abused, maybe they shouldn't have done it for a packet of crisps, or, you know, for, you know, all of this kind of like shitty rhetoric we hear all the time. And, you know, the woman came back saying no, and I was like, well, you know, okay, you can't change people's minds, but I just think it's so complex, and I think we talk about it in quite simplistic views, and I think what we need to be talking about is what is happening in this country that's leading some, and a very small minority, I think that needs to be stressed, but some young people to feel, no, I want nothing to do with this world, this feminism, this freedom that you call. I want to have this instead. Where are we failing our young people that ISIS isn't? Jesus Christ, you know, that's crazy.
Sasha, do you want to comment
on your point? I think you're absolutely right. It's a combination of the push and the pull factors, and it's extremely complex. I wanted to come to your point about empowerment, because I think it's counterintuitive for us to imagine that this is something that empowers young women, but that's exactly how they're seeing it, and we have to understand their own motivations in order to get ahead of the curve and deal with the problem. We've been monitoring the social media accounts of ISIS supporters and girls that have gone off to Syria, and it's fascinating to listen to the language that they use, that their own rationale for joining, and how deeply empowering they see this movement, despite the fact that on the ground, and we know what the realities are, we've seen now the publication of the Al-Qanza Moral Brigade's manifesto, and it's, you know, marrying girls off at 9, and it's, you know, not allowing women out of the home without supervision and all the rest. But actually, in terms of the motivation to get out there, and I think there is something that we really need to understand. There's a reaction, I think, a twofold reaction. One is a reaction often to very conservative milieus, and so these are not in any way radical or extreme, they're conservative. And so they will circumscribe, in a kind of soft way, certain choices for young women quite often, the choice of husband and partner, to some extent where they live and so on, that kind of background. There's nothing conservative about extremist organizations. These are militant. They're empowering in that sense. We have to remember that, because I think we have a tendency to think of these movements as conservative, and they're not. But the other part of it, I think, is a kind of failure of the emancipatory project of the West, the kind of Sex in the City culture of feminism that kind of objectifies women. We've talked to girls over and over who've abandoned the practices, the Islamic practices of their parents and of their grandmothers and their mothers, and have taken on certain practices, including, for instance, the wearing of the niqab, as a way of saying, this is me reclaiming myself. It's saying no to the objectification that I feel in this environment, and I feel it as an empowerment. And I think all of these things are counterintuitive for the general public, but have to be understood if we're going to get ahead of this. And I just want to rate that this question about the gender dynamic across different ideologies, I think is really important. We run a network of former extremists. It's now a global network of people who've been part of extremist and terrorist organizations of all different ideologies. And what's fascinating is how similar their stories are, whether they are former neo-Nazis or white supremacists or Islamists of different sorts, how similar their personal journeys often are. But the gender dynamic in terms of the old far right, you talked about the new right, the old neo-Nazi far right is interesting, because most of these kinds of extremist organizations have a very, very arcane view. I wouldn't say it's necessarily misogyny, but it's an arcane view of the position of women. So they see women in supportive roles as domestic support and so on. That's quite common across the board. And then at the same time, we're seeing women in all sorts of ways actually pushing those boundaries within the movement. And so we see them find more activist roles no matter what, even though they're circumscribed. And we've seen that in Palestine, we've seen that in Chechnya, and I think that we'll be seeing that later with these girls. So some of the accounts that we've been following of these young girls are saying, sadly, I'm not allowed to go out and fight now, but maybe, God willing, the day will come. And the narrative is incredibly violent. They're inciting violence. They're saying, if you can't get out here, do something back home. I want to be the first woman to behead somebody with a blunt knife. There's a sense of real aggression, of wishing to be part of the fight, that we also have to get a real, hand on, because it makes you turn away. You can't imagine that women would be that keen on the levels of violence that we're seeing. But it's part of the emancipatory sort of empowerment narrative that underlies all of it.
Sure, and I think that's something that's quite interesting as well, because it challenges our notions of gender roles and women being nurturing and nice and meek and sweet, and we don't hurt people, and so it always comes as a bit of a shock when we hear that women can hurt people, and of course we can. We're human beings. We're not just sweet, nice little things that are nice to everybody around us. And I think we see the same thing with serial killers. If it's a man, we're kind of like, okay, here's another man killing up people. If it's a woman, we're like, wow, what is wrong with her? Why is she? Or she's killed her own children. And it's sort of us understanding that actually you can't put women in these little boxes where we're nice and we don't do these harmful things. But I wanted to make a quick point, so that was just I think one of the other things which I think we really need to bear in mind is there's something about these young girls using these opportunities, perhaps in a really weird, twisted way, to write their own story. And I think there's power in that. And I think one of the things I'm really conscious of, and especially as a black feminist, is often we're not given opportunities or platforms to actually write or dictate our own stories. We often have people speak on our behalf. And that's what I talk about when I said being disillusioned by the feminist movement at the minute. And you see it a lot. So you often get sort of well-wished, well-intended feminists kind of say, well, look, Muslim woman, let me tell you what you're experiencing right now. And I'm like, oh, thanks, because I didn't know. That's really good to know that you know how I feel. And it's kind of like, but actually, because I love feminism, I love sisterhood, but actually let's work together, don't speak on my behalf. And I think what happens too often is you get people, and I'm using the term West and East, which I don't like, but the sort of binary word. You get people in the West kind of saying, oh, let's go, empower and free these women in the East with their backward notions of what it means to be, a woman. And actually, that's not helpful to anybody. And I think we need to be creating spaces where we're not, so you've got femin, this whole kind of like, oh, let's get our tits out because that's freedom, and, the opposite to like wearing a niqab. But then it's kind of like, but actually, where are the women who are supporting the Gulabi gang in India? These kick-ass women who are actually fighting sexual violence themselves. Indian women, what? And I think that's what the issue is. I think you've kind of got something called the white savior complex, which is doing my head in. And it's this notion that, we used to have, white men going over the white man's burden, but we now got the white woman's burden. And actually that's not helpful, because what you're doing is you're creating a hierarchy of suffering. And what you're saying is, you are suffering more than I am by patriarchy. Let me tell you what you need to do. And actually what we need to say is that we are all fucked by patriarchy, and what we need to do is work together to actually overthrow the system.
Do you think that women joining in with extremist movements, as we've seen through history and we seem to be seeing more now, is a failure of feminism to offer an alternative, or you just have to accept, look, men get sucked into extremism, women do too. There's no difference between a man and a woman becoming an extremist?
I think the answer to it is much broader than that. It's about society too. And I believe, and I agree with those cases that I've studied in Norway, because we have, across Europe, we have more or less the same percentage of the population is going. So in Norway we have 70 jihadists. In Britain you have 700, but you also have 10 times more citizens. So, and I agree, those who've gone, they're remarkably strong women. They're remarkably very advocating their views, their rights, and they're fighting for wearing the niqab. That's very often has been a start. And it's interesting to see how they argue for wearing the niqab or not having gymnastics with boys, for instance, in high school. They argue in very legalistic terms. They argue within the Norwegian state, where women are supposed to be heard, where youngsters are supposed to be heard, where you can argue with your headmaster, like for the right to what to wear or not. Terrorism, and then they go to Syria. We have several women who've gone to Syria. And of course, terror, whether it's far right or Islamic, it's a way of extreme way of wanting to be seen and wanting to be heard, and the feeling of my political response or my political voice is not being heard. So in Breivik's case, it's he felt he was being censored. He'd written this huge manifesto that nobody was interested in. It's cut and paste, very chaotic work, but nobody wants to read it. So what does he do to be read? He realizes he has to do a terror act, and he even counts like how many people do I have to kill? Well, he calculated 12. He ended up killing 77, and he called it the book launch, to be seen and read and heard. And of course, he is more an anomaly, and he's more an individual case than these girls. But for these girls, those cases that I've studied, I've seen, it's also about their voices are not heard. They don't feel that they can live in Norway. They don't feel that their way of life, which is being secluded, which is a society where they cannot touch the hand of a man, where they cannot bump into a man in the street without having problems afterwards. That they can't live their life in Norway. So they find a new life. Whether it's going to Syria and, as you say, starting to construct the caliphate, and they end up, as it looks now, being mothers and or washing, cleaning, but you might end up also be fighters in the future or coming back to our society. So I think that one issue that, of course, you're working with, that's really not my field, but it's about what kind of societies do we have? Like, is there something with us too that makes these girls give them the feeling of not being heard? Like, is there something in our feminist states, or I mean, in Norway, where it's where feminists have a strong voice, but what is it there that they can't really? They don't want to change it from within. They just want to either commit a terror act or construct a new world. But I think I don't have the answers for that. But I realize that we have to start with children. We have to start with childhood, because the cases of those who go, the great majority have a conflictuous childhood. Like a great majority, yes, you find these 3 girls who are obviously very talented, but most of them, the research says that most of them have criminal backgrounds. This is mainly the boys, but also the girls, that they have dysfunctional families. They have a background of often with drugs or petty crimes. It is there are early signs that I think we should address, and of course that's not a quick fix. That's a long-term fix to start with children and youth.
Do you think that in some ways the British state, the schools, the police, the government are in effect letting these girls, their families down? I mean, there was obviously some talk from the 3 girls that went from Bethnal Green that their friend had gone, and the police had gone to the school, but the parents weren't informed properly. I just wondered, in terms of what the authorities are doing to stop this and to try and help with de-radicalization, whether, Sasha, then Shabana, whether you thought that these families, these girls, are actually being let down?
Well, I think that there's a number of things happening. We've seen now a whole slew of individuals end up in Syria that were on watch lists and somehow slip through the net, and it begs the question, what's happening with that? I think there is a major challenge, both in terms of numbers, but the approach, I think, has really been problematic in so many ways. We talked about the government's strategies for prevention, which for, operating now for nearly a decade, I think has largely alienated people. It's been a highly divisive policy. It's, securitized the whole community debate. And in actual fact, the only way you can get around this issue is working with the families in the first place of individuals. What we do know is, for the very most part, these young people go off despite their families' wishes. There's a lot of peer-to-peer sort of in the same age group camaraderie, so families can play a role in that sense, but in terms of, there's a generational divide, and for the most part parents are trying to do something to stop. So work with parents is absolutely critical. I think there needs to be a protection ethos in terms of the way in which we approach this, and protecting young people, not just girls. I think it's really important to remember that young boys at 15 and 16 are just as vulnerable and stupid as their female counterparts in terms of being able, in terms of being groomed online. This isn't grooming of a traditional sexual nature. It does go across the board. But the one thing we do know, and we've been developing some programs in this space, is that it's really hard for frontline workers, whether it's teachers or social workers, the sorts of people that are most likely to see that something's going on with a young person, to see some changes emerging that they think could lead in a negative direction. They rarely have the tools to be able to confront people up front in a way that is both sensitive and not counterproductive. And I think there's a real challenge there in terms of being able to enable difficult conversations to happen early on, both in school and community settings, and then bringing in families and communities in serious ways. And we've developed a program now that we've piloted, we've launched across Canada. It's a national campaign called Extreme Dialogue, which is a set of really, really painful, hard-hitting films of former extremists, films of victims of extremism, the personal human stories that matter, people who've been intimately involved with these problems, that can speak to their personal journeys. And to bring those into classroom settings with guides and tools for teachers at the front line to start to have very difficult conversations before kids are being drawn in, before they're starting to get radicalized, when they're 12 and 13 and 14, so get ahead of the curve. And that hasn't happened at scale yet.
Shabana, you work with Prevent. Can you maybe just describe a little bit, for those who don't know, how Prevent works and why you think it hasn't been effective?
Sure. So what I want to stress is that Prevent has different levels of success depending on what city has rolled it out. Unfortunately, in Bristol, it hasn't been too bad. And in Birmingham, you may have read a few years ago, they did things like put cameras in Muslim areas as a way of keeping surveillance on communities, which of course is alienating. In Bristol, it was quite good in that we tried to set up more kind of sort of two-way platforms where we could have a two-way conversation, and the communities very much formed the work that we did. But it was still very much like, okay, let's talk about, Muslims, let's talk about extremism. What are your thoughts? And I remember I was part of the Young Muslim, advisory group, and we were having some sort of seminar with ACPO, who were talking about the need to sort of work more with young people. And I was thinking, oh, great, brilliant, okay, let's work more with young people. And they said, well, let's go into schools and speak to young Muslims about, extremism. I think it's really important that we do that. And I kind of said, yeah, do you know what? It is quite important to speak to young Muslims about extremism, but they also want to speak about other issues that's affecting them, so they want to speak about the impact of porn on young people. They want to talk about the fact that, at universities you've got lap dancing clubs now, or sort of, societies. And why are we just saying to Muslims, let's just speak about this? And I agree, I think the work in schools needs to be challenging, but it needs to go back so many layers, because I think one of the things that's an issue with the education system is that, and this isn't just the Muslim community, this is most racial groups, we aren't part of the education system, if that makes sense. We are part of the fabric of the society, but we don't get that representation. I did history from primary school all the way up to university, and not once did I actually learn about the Muslim contribution towards World War II or World War I, or, and I remember thinking, but I'm part of this country, this is my land, where's my history? Why am I not being told about the importance that, the Sepoys in India played during World War II. And I think there's, in feminism, we talk about history being his story and not her story. We need to extend that beyond and look at, well, hang on a second, where else are we failing our young people? If they feel that, the only time they learn about otherness is either talking about colonialism or slavery, of course we're going to have a second-class citizen sort of mentality. We want to talk about when we ruled the world too, and that needs to happen at a much earlier stage, and the education system is failing young people. And that's not just race, that's a class thing as well. I mean, history is very pale, male, stale, and we need to sort of look at how to make, schools actually reflect the diverse communities that they represent, and actually try and engage with young people in a way which isn't saying, here's a history that you've got nothing to do with, and actually you were enslaved. But it was a long time ago. Isn't it great how things have moved on? No, let's talk about how history impacts us today and start doing that by actually talking about what happened in history in the first place.
Well, thank you so much to Shabana, to Sasha, to Åsne. Just to say, Åsne's book, if you're interested in extremism, has had fantastic reviews. Thank you very much to the panel for an amazing discussion. Thank you.